Hello everyone. I'm Erik. I'm on the Ember core team. I've been working on Ember for almost 3 years now, it's been an amazing journey. I'm lucky I have been able to make my living doing Ember consulting for the last couple years, I'm grateful for you guys all coming. Thanks to Dockyard again for putting this on. It's awesome to see a full room here in Boston. And thanks for having me. So, first off, there's an elephant in the room. If you've seen our talk, if you've paid attention, the reason I am called the human hype machine, there's this thing called HTML bars that we're still working on. It's going to save everyone. It's a wonderful thing. There is no problem it does not solve. But this talk is not about HTML bars, so sorry. I've said everything I could possibly say, I think, about HTML bars, we're working hard on it. I think Chris Selden, who is in Seattle today, is probably hacking on it as I speak. I'm looking forward to shipping. We're looking forward, the Ember core team's looking forward to shipping that to you soon, hopefully in the coming weeks. So that's all I'm going to say about HTML bars timelines. Feel free to troll me afterwards if you haven't already trolled me before. So let's talk about, the title of this talk is Ember Today and Tomorrow. But I first want to talk a little bit about how we've gotten to where we are today in web development. So yesteryear. In 1989, HTML was created by Tim Berners-Lee, and there were things about it that are kind of interesting if you think about web development today. Things like the form and input tags weren't even part of the original HTML spec. And back then, HTTP didn't even have the post method, right? So like HTML, HTTP were designed for a different kind of web than what we have today. And in '93, the Mosaic browser was released, and those features, this is a great quote that I found doing research a while back. It extended these features that Tim Berners-Lee had added to HTML, and it added things such as images, nested lists, and fill-out forms. Academics and software engineers later would argue that many of these extensions were very much ad hoc and not properly designed. So these are the features that we're still working with today, right? Facepalm. Oh God, this is terrible. You can't see anything. Oh, that's too bad. Alongside of that, the CGI interface was created, and this was basically the way that you built dynamic websites. And so now we had a mechanism to render HTML server-side dynamically dependent upon form input from a user. And so this was like the birth of web applications, right? And if you fast forward 2 years, then in '95, we got the creation of JavaScript. It came with Netscape 2.0. And if you fast forward another 2 years, Microsoft introduced the first mechanisms for doing data loading asynchronously in the browser. And those started with iframes in '97, and then went to what is the XML HTTP interface in IE5, which a year later became what other browsers implemented as XML HTTP request. And so this is AJAX, right? This is what enabled the AJAX revolution. And we can see that if we look at the type of applications that were built at this time, right? So with 2000, one of the pioneering applications, web applications, was Outlook Web Access, and then Outpost in 2002, Gmail in 2004, Google Maps in 2005, and then also in 2005 we started coining this term AJAX. AJAX became a thing. And in 2006, we see, this is a random kind of timeline, a scattering of events, but jQuery 1.0 was released, and that's kind of a momentous moment, I think, in the story of web development. And so, if you think about it, though, it actually took 7 years from like the introduction of this technology in the browser to, jQuery 1.0, which might be seen as like a fence post there, right? And so, that's kind of sad. This is a Picard facepalm, if you can't tell. Web development could have started proliferating. These complex web applications could have gotten started to get built sooner, but, we were pretty happy with the way that, I don't know if you would say happy, but we've been building web applications a certain way for a while, and, it wasn't until the AJAX revolution that things kind of changed somewhat. But they didn't change completely. They changed, in the sense that now we had a mechanism for loading data decoupled from a server page load, right? And so yesterday's technologies reflect that. We have server-rendered HTML, and we just sprinkle in JavaScript, right? And we have jQuery, and eventually we build enough sophisticated applications with jQuery, and we end up with jQuery spaghetti, right? And so we've learned that lesson, and we know that we don't want to continue duplicating our rendering logic on the client and the server. This was a side effect. We had jQuery spaghetti, but we also had server spaghetti to deal with all of the different ways in which the application could be potentially rendered, or we had duplicated logic and templating code on both the server and the client to deal with these cases where, oh, you know what, this section of the application should be more interactive, so we're going to do the extra work to actually be able to render this stuff on the client so that we have a rich internet application, or the beginnings of what you might call one. And so, so let's talk about today, right? I think today we're in an interesting transitional period in the web development world. And really, a lot of, I think, what we're seeing today, the push to make web development better kind of started with the iPhone and touch-based paradigm changing people's expectations for what software should be like. And so I think we tried, early on in the mobile, well, I mean, the iPhone came out, there wasn't an SDK. The only SDK was to build web applications, and we tried doing that, and we realized that we couldn't actually build as good of experiences as we could natively. And when Apple came and released the native SDKs for iOS, then we saw a drastic difference in the haves and have-nots, right? And the web being the have-nots. And so the interesting thing, though, is that there has been a lot of momentum in the web, and we have evergreen browsers today, and JavaScript performance has increased amazingly. I think, I've heard numbers like V8 is like 100 times faster today than it was when it first, started getting developed. And so now we live in a different world, and we may not necessarily realize it yet, because we have capabilities to build things in the browser that we didn't have before, but we haven't really, I don't think, begun to fully exploit what's possible. And so, this is where Ember.js comes in, right? Like, we're bringing back the 80s with client and server, right? The server becomes our API, and the client does most of the work now. And so, I'm not going to talk, we all know and hopefully love and have used Ember, so I'm not going to talk a ton about Ember. But I think, the way that I view Ember is I view Ember as a community effort to try to start exploiting what is capable in the browser today, right? And we're all in this together. We're trying to figure out how we can build applications better than we can on our own by coming together and rolling up, patterns and conventions. And so today we've done a pretty good job of that, and I'm pretty happy with where Ember is today. And so one of the important things that we realized was that it's not just the story about building these applications and the client-side JavaScript. There's also a story around tooling that needs to happen. And so we've been, Steph and Rob and the community have done an amazing job at bringing a tooling story, a build story, alongside of our client-side story. And Ember CLI is really exciting because it's giving us a taste of the future, and it's also going to be enabling us to continue to have a taste of the future. And so today, we can do that already with ES6 modules, right? We can write this kind of code today where we can import from a file, we can export from a file. Nothing too amazing, but the great thing, it's not that this wasn't possible before, it's that, again, we've come together, this is being standardized in the language, and now this is a convention that we can build on top of. And Ember CLI enables this by, enabling us to write this code and compile it into code that's usable on all of the clients that we support today, right? So, let's talk a bit. I'm like flying through my slides. I got to slow down. So let's talk a bit about tomorrow's technologies. So the great thing about being a JavaScript developer today in this day and age, and I consider myself lucky because I got involved in JavaScript heavily in the last 3 years, primarily getting into Ember. And so I got to avoid a lot of the kind of like nuclear holocaust days of JavaScript development in the browser, right? I was doing server-side stuff, so I was still dealing with a lot of the, the fallout of the stagnation of the web platform. But the exciting thing is that today, the language and the platform is evolving pretty fast in comparison to its previous, in recent history, right? And so what that means for JavaScript is that we're getting new versions of the language. And the thing we hear about today a lot is ES6. ES6 is coming, But the interesting thing is that ES7 has actually already started getting worked on, and there's already proposals happening with ES7. And ES7 is actually going to be, ES6 was the last, I think, what I've been told is going to be like the last big release, language release. There's not going to be any more, stop the world, we need to get all these features in by this date, and then we're going to ship this huge, huge release. The ES7 and future language releases are actually going to happen more iteratively. They're going to be, I don't recall, but they're going to be the exact details, but they're going to be more on the scale of like a year and not 5 years or whatever, right? It's been a long time since ES5 was released, and hopefully now we're going to start seeing smaller iterations, just like how we build software. Why aren't we, why doesn't our standards process work a little bit more like that? So ES6 is really exciting because it brings a ton of awesome new features to the language. And so I just want to, hopefully this is not terrible. I just want to cover a few of the things that I think are awesome. This is a great GitHub repo that you should check out if you haven't already. It's git.io/ES6 features. Check this out. You can even do it while I'm talking. This is like the best documentation on the standards, the upcoming standards that I've seen. It's basically a list of all of the, the big new features, and then these are all linked to little descriptions, and code examples of that feature in action. And so one of the exciting things about ES6 are arrow functions. So that's gonna bring some conciseness to our code. They're very much like the fat arrows in CoffeeScript, which is great. And classes are another huge, big feature to the language that are going to be great. So we've finally got a proper, one of the things that Ember did back 3 years ago when I was getting started writing a lot of JavaScript code, one of the most compelling features of Ember was like, wow, there's an actual object system that it feels like I can do grown-up programming in JavaScript. I can call super, I can have, I can subclass easily without a lot of boilerplate. I can have mix-ins. These kind of things are great, and that was one of the first things that attracted me about Ember. But a lot of these things are coming to the language finally. So we're going to have a nice class syntax, and it's going to have super support as well. So that's fantastic. There's also a bunch of cool little, enhanced object literal stuff. The other big thing that I am very, very excited about is what they call template strings. But this is, the TLDR on this is, we finally get multi-line strings in JavaScript. So that is fantastic, right? And string interpolation as well, right? So those two are like, oh my. There's also a ton of other cool stuff like destructuring, assignment. Default arguments are going to be huge as well. Default and REST args. So you'll be able to say, provide a default value for something. You'll be able to slice off the, you'll be able to have like a var args style API and just get an array of all those arguments without doing crazy array slice stuff on the arguments object. So this stuff is very, very cool, and that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about ES6 features. But check this out, know what's coming down the pipe. And the cool thing, the one thing that I think is really interesting and exciting to be a part of is that the Ember community is pretty heavily involved in the standards process. Yehuda Katz, one of the creators of Ember, sits on TC39, which is the JavaScript language standardization committee. So we are definitely, we've got our finger on the pulse of upcoming language features. We're helping to influence them, and I think that's a really great thing about, you're going to see that in Ember, I think. And so we've always got our eye on the future, not only of the language itself, but of additional platform features that are being added in the browser. And so one of the goals, I think, that the core team really cares about is having Ember and the Ember community start using these new language features before they start shipping. And we already see that today in Ember CLI with the ES6 modules system, right? But not only just use these features, but also be able to start using them so that we can actually participate in the process of standardization. We can actually use features potentially before browsers implement them in our applications, and then be able to actually have an opinion, right, about the real world usage of them. And so this process I've coined a transitional transpilation, where basically, we're going to start having transpilation systems that enable us to experiment with features that maybe even in the proposed state in the standards committees and not even necessarily on the the standards track. So we can actually start experimenting, providing feedback. But these transpilations may not always be as high fidelity as the actual features are, meaning they may not be, well, I think when you're writing transpilation code, you should really try to make it as close to what the spec intends it to be as possible, because then you're truly future-proofing that code that you write. But in cases, it is actually very difficult to do that, and especially do it in a performant way. So that's kind of what I mean by transitional transpilation, because you may not be able to actually get it all the way to the finish line with regards to the intended spec behavior. But anyways, a really cool project is being worked on by our buddies at Square, and that's the ES Next project. And I just want to show real quick, this is the, this is it. This is the ES Next repo on GitHub. It's just an NPM module that you can install. And you're going to start seeing, this is pretty much a very similar subset of the list that we saw on the ES6 features repo README. And that's not a coincidence. It's actually, Bryn Donovan, who's really leading the effort on this project, is actually sitting there looking at the features, trying to implement these transpilers using Esprima, and trying to get them as solid as possible. And the interesting thing is that he was historically a heavy CoffeeScript user, and now he's kind of well, I want these new features, but I don't want to. I need to have them usable today so that I can convince my team that it's worth making the transition. And so ES Next is kind of an engineer's, a determined engineer trying to get these new language features usable in this production code today, so that he can migrate his team off of CoffeeScript and onto the ES6, and potentially not just it's intentionally not called ES6 something, because it's going to continue to keep having features of additional versions of JavaScript, such as ES7, ES8 and stuff. So this is really cool. He's also the guy that wrote the module transpiler that we use for Ember CLI. So big thanks to him. He's really been great at leading this charge. And so we've got things like classes, generators, arrow functions, template strings already transpilable today. And the cool thing about this is that you might imagine that one of the big reasons why we have something like Ember CLI is to enable us to give this to you potentially for free. Just build it right in to our build tools, so that you can start using these. We can achieve that goal of enabling Ember itself and the Ember community to start using these new features and being more productive today without a whole lot of work. And so Robert actually surprised me. I was looking around somehow on GitHub, and I saw that he had actually started working on an add-on story for Ember CLI. I think Joe had mentioned that earlier today, and he's started actually some work on integrating the ESNext transpiler into Ember CLI via an add-on, and I'm really excited about this work because, you know, I want multi-line strings, damn it, and string interpolation. Those are like the things that I miss most from CoffeeScript. I used to write CoffeeScript as well. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the efforts that we have underway to modernize Ember. And of course, the big one that you know about already is HTML bars, which is our next generation templating system. And another thing that's kind of a side effect of HTML bars is that we're now going to have an optional jQuery dependency. And so these are steps that we're taking, you know, to modernize Ember, you know, because a lot of the reasons we had a jQuery dependency were to support, you know, old browser bugs, and, you know, the days of everybody supporting IE 6 and 7 are starting to wane. And so, you know, I'm not saying that we're not going to necessarily drop support for those in Ember itself. There are people still supporting them and using Ember, but you'll be able to make the decision, I don't need jQuery perhaps, you know, and you can just use small shims or your own, or the raw DOM APIs yourself. And so another exciting thing is we are beginning to explore new platform features as well. And so in building Ember, we've had to build a lot of these foundational technologies ourselves. You know, Ember's big because we had to do a lot of work to get to the point that we're at today, right? And so the cool thing is that the platform, like I've been saying, like things are moving fast. The platform's evolving, and a lot of the features that we've had to implement inside of Ember are actually starting to show up in the web platform itself. And one of the big one that I want to talk about is Object Observe. And so, you know, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's got a very simple API service. You have a JavaScript object. You can call object.observe, pass that object in, and then you provide a callback. And that callback will get called with an array of changes. And so this is an asynchronous API. You can get batches of multiple changes, and the browser determines when to call that, but it's fast. You don't really have to worry too much about that. And so how would you use it? What does it look like? Well, you can have an object with a first name property. You can just set a property, you know, update that property, and then your callback's going to get called with an array of change objects, and they're going to look something like this. In this case, we've got an update type change, right? And the first name field was changed, and then the old value is provided here, so we can see what the value was previously. And then we get an updated reference to that object that has changed. So here is that object that I updated the first name on, and you can see that it has the new value there, right? And so we've already started doing some experimentation with Object Observe integration. I don't have any dates or anything. This is what is that? The line they use when you're like listening to an investor call. It's like, these are forward-looking statements that they may not reflect the yada, 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 yada. So this is the kind of stuff, though, that's exciting because it allows us to start gutting some of the pieces of our metal and runtime libraries because the platform's actually giving these features to us. And the features are coming faster than you might expect. This was a tweet from a few weeks ago from Adi Asmani, who's on the Chrome team. And, you know, it's starting to, the Object Observe is starting to ship in the Chrome 36 beta a few weeks ago. And so folks on the Polymer team are already using it, and, you know, it's on our radars, and, you know, also Angulars, and I'm sure other JavaScript libraries and frameworks. So the other cool platform feature that I want to touch on is web components, but particularly custom elements. because I don't think everybody has seen what the custom element API looks like, or so I wanted to show that. So this is using the ES6 class syntax. And so this is how you would define a component that, just a custom element, right? And so a custom element is basically what a web component is, right? It's my dash component. I'm not showing it. There would be a call to document.register. You pass the string, what you want the tag name to be, and then you pass in this class reference here, my component in this case. And so you might be like squinting and looking at these callbacks, and you might think like, wow, those sound familiar. Those seem like things that I'm already familiar with. And so we've got things like created callback, which is like basically the function that'll get called after the element gets instantiated, right? The object, the JavaScript object for that. The attached callback, when you put it in the DOM, that's what gets called. When you remove it from the DOM, that's detached gets called. And there's a little interesting one, the attribute change. You might not have seen something like this before, but basically anytime an attribute is set on that element, you get this callback fired, right? And so you might already be translating this into the Ember component equivalent, right? Which is Ember component or Ember view.extend, right? You've got an init function, you've got a did insert element call, you got a will destroy element call, and then kind of one of the divergences here is that we have like attribute bindings, or attributes aren't necessarily things that get exposed from the JavaScript object side out to the element, and so you would set up observers to explicitly set up observers on an attribute that you were interested in watching. And so the cool thing though is that I wanted to show you what this might look like with ES6 and ES7 classes, right? And this is going to start looking a lot more like the original example would, right? So the original like native custom element API, right? So we've got init, did insert element, will destroy element, and then so this is using the class style syntax, so you don't have to even provide the function keyword or even an arrow, right? You just provide the name, parens, and the curly braces. And so down at the bottom, though, there's a proposal for ES6 class decorators, and this is basically how Ember may end up supporting the type of like you're used to doing, like function dot property dot observes, whatever. This might be how that actually gets implemented using the proposed ES7 syntax, right? So that's cool, and right, like if you kind of switch between these, they don't look too far apart. And in fact, maybe we end up actually like aliasing these things so that you could actually just have something that was an Ember component or was a custom element and kind of use them using the same, put a shim there and support either side, either API style, right? So I think we're really excited to keep continuing to experiment with these new platform features and language features. Like I said, there's nothing to announce. I'm sorry, I have no hyping to do other than sharing the knowledge that these things exist, and this is kind of what we're thinking about them. But the safe answer is basically like, as browsers start implementing these features and they start shipping and we start seeing market share rise, they're going to start becoming higher priorities on our roadmap, right? We want to, and who knows, maybe there is a strategy that we can take where we can actually start implementing some of these features, enable you to start using them if you only have to support, the most modern of browsers, and kind of make it swappable, basically modular, so you can choose to use the super modern Ember version that only works on mono browsers versus not. But we'll see. You guys can help make that decision. So I want to talk about some more tooling related improvements that are coming down the pipe that I think are really exciting and interesting. So if you haven't heard about what we've been referring to as lazy loading, you should check out this issue on Ember CLI. But basically, lazy loading, the general concept is, wouldn't it be nice if when you were going to your Ember app, you didn't have to send the JavaScript for the entire application, right? What if you could send perhaps a shared set of library code, like jQuery and Ember itself, potentially like global application code, and then the code that's actually related to that route that you're loading, right? And so there's a couple motivations for why we want something like this to exist. The most obvious one is, well, if I send less JavaScript to the browser, then the browser has less work to do when your application's booting, so you can improve boot speeds, right? And so that's pretty important for mobile applications that, especially if you're targeting older devices, there's a significant cost of just interpreting JavaScript code, right? So that's great. But there's also another potential benefit, which is we hear from a lot of the big companies that have large Ember apps. They're like, hey, we want to actually split our Ember application into separate applications, right? And so the idea of having a conventional way for how code in an application could get automatically loaded by Ember starts enabling us to think about how we could potentially have separate applications or application code that lives in separate repositories, so that there's not 50 people in one organization committing to a single repository, right? And you don't have to. And companies actually have started building their own mechanisms for gluing together these separate repositories full of Ember code. And so we think, again, we want shared solutions to problems so that we can not worry about so that we can focus on our applications domain specific problems, not how should I build my framework this month because I currently think this is the right way I should do it. We want to write less code ourselves that is not directly valuable to our business and our product, right? And so having a shared solution for this is great, and it's definitely on the radar and being discussed. And we've also done some exploration as to how we might start enabling this. And then also another very important kind of related piece of work that's happening is continuing to modularize Ember itself. So Ember has been pretty good about actually building Ember in different, in layers, and we have separations between these layers, and those layers can actually be shipped as like their own little libraries and stuff. And so the one thing though is that actually those library or those packages, still tend to be rather chunky. And so wouldn't it be great? I think the ultimate goal of this modularization work that we've been doing, you might have heard like, oh, Ember is now using ES6 modules, in the Ember source code. So yeah, that's part of the path. That's kind of the first step in this direction. But the ultimate goal here, and this is an Ember CLI feature as well, is that your deploys only include the parts of Ember that you actually use, right? So that again, this is another big deal for mobile applications, right? Where you only want, if your big boot time cost is interpreting JavaScript, then you want to, push out as much JavaScript. You want to, interpret as little JavaScript as possible. And so, if you're not using certain pieces of Ember APIs, then why are they getting sent down the wire, right? And so, this is, I think, kind of the mother of all features that I'm personally really excited about, second to HTML bars. I don't have a timeline on this one, but the cool thing is that it actually has dovetailed really nicely with the work that's been happening on the ES6 module transpiler. And so we've actually already got example module transpilation that actually does not include code that is not imported, in the built output. And so I don't think we're super far off from this becoming a reality. But the great thing is it's one of those benefits, right, of having a conventional build system and tooling system for our conventional framework, right? because we can start rolling these, we can achieve new features that you would not be able to do otherwise, right? If you didn't also own the build tool story. So to sum up, I think I've had an amazing 2014. It's been a great year for Ember. We've had two awesome Ember conferences, and I think the momentum in the community, the adoption has been fantastic, and together we're going to keep evolving, right? And so that's my message for today. So thank you very much. Do we have time for Q&A, or do we have time for Q&A? Do we have any time for Q&A?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
I actually have a question to start
Okay.
with. So the future of JavaScript moving with all the, it seems like it's very heavily dependent upon evergreen browsers.
Sure.
And one thing I recently learned was that in certain spaces, they're using older browsers, but then you say, okay, they're eventually going to have to upgrade. But like in government space, in some healthcare spaces, they're turning off the evergreen features.
Yeah.
How does that coincide? Because it seems like that right now we are making up for that with polyfills and transpilation. Yep. But it seems like if we're going to be focusing on just evergreen browsers moving forward, that's going to create a huge divide eventually.
So I didn't mean to convey the thought that we're only focusing on evergreen browsers at all. That's certainly not the case. That's why I was saying these are forward-looking statements. It's definitely an ideal world, and I'll be the first to have my doubts as to like how the story's going to unfold, perhaps on the on the less evergreeny of evergreens, things like Safari on the Mac and on iOS. They tend to have they do their browser updates with the OS releases, right? So it's not something like a bug gets fixed in a week because a new Chrome release, or every 6 weeks because there's a new Chrome release or something, right? So again, like I mentioned, like the trick here is that it's going to be a balance, and I think ultimately, depending on how reality shakes out, we're going to have a situation, I think, where we're going to want to potentially have the ability to have a version of Ember that is using these new technologies because you can assume modern browsers. So mobile tends to be a case where this is the case. Usually you're writing, you're targeting, especially with like hybrid mobile, right, where you're doing native wrappers around HTML5 apps. You know that you have modern APIs to use, and it's a shame to have all of the polyfills and kind of base your framework around a bunch of assumptions that aren't the case for your use case, and a large chunk of use cases, right? Because that's a real market. And so I don't think we want to cede that market to somebody else. I think what we need to do is think about how can we have the best of both worlds, right? How can we have a modern Ember that can assume things while still having that same version of Ember with a lot of, if not all of those same features, but with a, something a la like a polyfill. It's not really a polyfill, but potentially polyfills, right? So like, how could we have something like object observes, right? Or, maybe, I hate to say that we might end up in a world where like, you can write nicer syntax if you're supporting modern browsers, and you don't get as nice of syntax on other browsers. But it's still too soon to say. I think the ultimate statement that I wanted to make by talking about this was to say it's an exciting time to be a web developer. The platform is evolving, and Ember is going to evolve with it as fast as we can. And and so that's kind of like the real message. But I think there's a lot of hard problems to solve still, right? It's not going to be a cakewalk. So.